Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. In the vast and forgiving landscapes of the West, a man's life can be snuffed out as easily as a candle in the wind. But sometimes, in the deepest darkness, a light appears from the most unexpected of places. This is the story of a man who was left for dead, and the three women who brought him back, not just to life, but to a fight he never knew he was meant to lead. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth of the Cimarron territory. For John Carter, the heat was a familiar and welcome companion, a constant reminder of the harshness of the life he had chosen. He was a rancher, a man in his late 40s, his face a roadmap of hard years and quiet sorrows, his hands as tough and calloused as the leather of his reins. He was riding home, his body aching with the deep, bone-weary fatigue that comes from a long day of mending fences under a relentless sky. His ranch, the Circle C, was a lonely spread, a small island of stubborn life in a vast sea of dust and sagebrush. It had been lonelier still since his wife, Martha, had been taken by the fever 2 years prior. Now, it was just him, his cattle, and the ghosts of a happier time. He was taking a shortcut through a narrow, rocky arroyo, his mind on a cool drink of water and the simple peace of his empty home, when his world exploded. They came out of the rocks like a pack of coyotes, 4 of them, their faces masked by dirty bandanas, their eyes cold and predatory. He had no time to react, no time to reach for the worn Colt at his hip. A heavy, blunt object crashed against the side of his head, and the world dissolved into a blinding flash of white-hot pain. He fell from his saddle, a dead weight, and hit the ground hard. He was vaguely aware of rough hands searching his pockets, of the sound of his horse being led away, of a final, vicious kick to his ribs. Then, there was only darkness. He lay there, bleeding in the dust, as the sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. He was dying. He knew it with a calm, detached certainty. His life was seeping out of him, a small, dark pool in the vast indifference of the desert. He thought of Martha, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. He would be with her soon. But fate, in its strange and inscrutable way, had other plans for John Carter. He was roused from his descent into darkness by a touch. It was a gentle touch, cool and soft against his fevered skin. He opened his eyes, or tried to. One was swollen shut. Through the other, he saw a blurry, dreamlike image. 3 figures, silhouetted against the twilight sky. They were women. Native women, their long, dark hair braided, their faces etched with a quiet, solemn concern. He thought he was dreaming, that they were angels come to guide him to the other side. One of them, a young woman with eyes as dark and deep as a forest pool, placed a hand on his forehead. She spoke in a language he did not understand, her voice a soft, melodic murmur. Another, older, with a face like a beautiful, weathered map, began to clean the gash on his head with a cloth dipped in water. The third, a girl who could not have been more than 16, began to gather herbs from the arroyo, her movements quick and sure. They worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency. They cleaned his wounds. They applied a poultice of crushed leaves to his head that was cool and soothing. They set his dislocated shoulder with a grunt of shared effort and a skill that spoke of a deep, ancient knowledge. They gave him water to drink, a bitter, herbal tea that eased the fire in his veins. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He was aware of them tending to him through the night, a silent, vigilant circle of care. They did not speak his language, and he did not speak theirs. But in the universal language of kindness, of shared humanity, a profound and powerful communication was taking place. They were saving his life. When the sun rose, he was weak, his body a symphony of pain, but he was alive. The fever had broken. He saw that they had built a small travois. The 3 women, with a strength that belied their slender frames, lifted him onto it. "Where?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. The oldest woman just pointed, not at the trail back to his ranch, but deeper into the wilderness. He understood. To take him back would be to expose themselves. They were taking him to their own secret place, to finish the work of healing. For the next week, he was their patient. They took him to a hidden camp in a small, green canyon, a place the world had forgotten. They nursed him, fed him, and slowly, painstakingly, brought him back from the brink of death. He learned their names, spoken in their own tongue, which he began to pick up in fragments. The old woman was Noya Sky, The young woman was Alara, Starlight. The girl was Kimmy, Secret. He learned they were the last of their small band, a family of women who had been displaced by the endless, encroaching tide of the white man's world. They were survivors, living in the margins, their only possessions their knowledge and their courage. A deep, powerful bond formed between the gruff, solitary rancher and the three women who had saved him. He had been a man locked in his own grief, his heart a closed, barren place. Their simple, profound kindness began to pry it open. When he was finally strong enough to ride, they led him back to the edge of his own land. He did not know how to thank them. Words were inadequate. He had no money to offer them, and he knew they would not accept it if he did. He tried to ask them to come with him, to offer them the safety of his ranch. But Noya, the matriarch, just shook her head, a sad, knowing smile on her face. Their worlds were too different. He watched them as they melted back into the wilderness, three silent, graceful figures. He did not know if he would ever see them again. But he knew, with a certainty that was a new, warm presence in his chest, that he owed them a debt of life. And John Carter was a man who always paid his debts. John returned to his ranch a changed man. The physical wounds began to heal, but the experience in the arroyo had left a deeper, more profound mark on his soul. The solitude he had once embraced as a form of penance now felt like a hollow, empty thing. The silence of his home was no longer just the absence of his wife's voice, it was the absence of the three women who had brought him back to life. He threw himself into his work, trying to outrun the memory of their kindness, but it was no use. Their faces were etched in his mind. Noah's quiet wisdom, Kimmy's youthful resilience, Alara's deep, compassionate eyes. He found himself scanning the horizon, half hoping, half fearing, that he would see them again. A month passed. The rhythm of his life returned, but the melody was different. The dull ache of grief was still there, but it was now accompanied by the sharp, poignant pang of a debt he could not repay. The world outside his valley intruded, as it always did, in the form of a trip to the nearest town, a place called Dust Devil Gulch. It was a typical frontier town, a collection of false-fronted buildings and broken dreams, a place where the vices were cheap and life was cheaper. John went for supplies, his business to be conducted with his usual quiet efficiency. But as he walked the dusty main street, he began to hear whispers. They were ugly whispers, the kind that travel on the hot, dry wind of the plains. Whispers of a new commodity in the territory's black market. He was in the general store, buying a sack of flour, when he first heard it clearly. Two grimy prospectors were talking in low, conspiratorial tones. Caught him up near the Cimarron, one of them said. A whole family of 'em. The men fought back, so they killed him. But the women, he let out a low, lewd chuckle. They say Slater's got 'em. Plans to sell 'em at the auction. The other prospector whistled. Tribal women. They'll fetch a high price. Especially the young ones. A cold, sick feeling began to spread through John's gut. The Cimarron. It was the same area where he had been attacked, the same area where Noe, Alara, and Kimmy lived. It was probably a coincidence, he told himself. There were many native families living in those hills. But the seed of a terrible fear had been planted. He finished his business and went to the saloon, a place he usually avoided. He needed a drink, and he needed more information. The saloon was a noisy, smoke-filled den, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and desperation. He sat in a dark corner, nursing a beer, and listened. The whispers were louder here, fueled by alcohol and greed. The name Slater was on everyone's lips. Jedediah Slater was a ruthless, ambitious man who was quickly building a small, dark empire in the territory. He dealt in stolen cattle, smuggled guns, and, it was now being whispered, human flesh. The auction was not a public affair. It was a secret, illegal event, held for a select clientele of the territory's most depraved and wealthy men. It was to be held in 2 days, at a hidden, abandoned line shack a few miles outside of town. John listened, his face a stony, unreadable mask, but inside, a storm was gathering. The possibility that the women being spoken of were his women, the ones who had saved him, was a thought so terrible he could barely contain it. He left the saloon, his half-finished beer forgotten. He had what he needed. He spent the next day in a state of grim, focused activity. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a man preparing for a fight. He went to the bank and withdrew a substantial sum of his savings, converting it to gold coin. He went back to the general store and bought not just supplies, but ammunition. A lot of it. The storekeeper gave him a curious look, expecting a war, John. Just a long winter, John replied, his voice flat. On the day of the auction, he did not ride to the line shack. He knew a direct confrontation would be foolish. He was one man against Slater's entire outfit. He had to be smarter. He went back to town. He found the local blacksmith, a man of immense size and quiet integrity named Ben, who had been a friend of his for years. Ben, John said, his voice a low, urgent rumble. I need a favor. A big one. He told Ben a part of the story, not the whole truth, but enough. He told him about the women who had saved his life, and about the whispers he had heard. He told him about Slater's auction. Ben's face, usually placid, hardened into a mask of grim anger. Slater is a plague on this land, he said. What do you need me to do? John's plan was a simple one, a desperate gamble. He gave Ben a heavy pouch of gold. I need you to go to that auction, he said. I need you to buy those women for me. No matter the price. I'll pay you back every cent. And you? Ben asked. Where will you be? I'll be close, John said, a cold, dangerous light in his eyes. I'll be the insurance policy, in case Slater decides not to honor the deal. He was placing all his trust, and the lives of the three women, in the hands of his friend. He knew that if the bidding went too high, or if Slater was in a bad mood, the plan could fail. But it was the only chance he had. As dusk fell, Ben, his face set in a grim, determined expression, rode out towards the line shack. John, a silent shadow in the twilight, followed at a distance. He was a man riding towards a reckoning, a man about to call in a debt of life, in a place where the only currency that truly mattered was the speed of a man's gun. The abandoned line shack was a festering sore on the face of the prairie. It stood in a shallow, dusty bowl of a valley, a place where the shadows seemed to linger even at midday. A score of horses were tied to a makeshift rail, and the low, guttural sounds of men's laughter and drunken boasts drifted out from the lamplit windows. This was the Devil's Marketplace, a place where souls were bought and sold. John Carter watched from a high ridge, a quarter-mile away. He lay flat on his belly, a powerful spyglass to his eye, his old Winchester rifle resting on a rock before him. He was a patient, motionless predator, his heart a cold, steady drumbeat. He could see Ben's familiar, broad-shouldered figure moving through the crowd of men, his face a mask of grim determination. The auction was held in the open, in the hard-packed dirt yard in front of the shack. A crude platform had been erected, and a large, brutish man with a booming voice was acting as the auctioneer. The buyers were a loathsome collection of the territory's worst elements, wealthy, corrupt ranchers, fugitive outlaws with fresh money, and the owners of the sordid brothels and dance halls from the distant mining camps. They sold cattle first, clearly stolen, their brands expertly altered. Then came the guns, a crate of new Henry rifles, still in their factory grease. John watched it all with a detached, cold fury. This was the underbelly of the West he had tried to forget. And then, they brought out the women. John's breath caught in his throat. His hands tightened on his rifle. It was them. Noe, Elora, and Kimmy. They were bound at the wrists, their heads bowed, their beautiful, traditional buckskin clothes torn and filthy. They were being herded onto the platform like cattle. Noia, the proud matriarch, stood as tall and embowed as she could, a look of pure, defiant hatred in her eyes. Kimmy, the young girl, was trembling, her face a mask of pure terror. And Elora stood with a strange, vacant look in her eyes, as if her spirit had already retreated to a place where these men could not touch her. The sight of them, these women who had shown him such profound, gentle kindness, being treated as livestock, ignited a fire in John's soul that was so hot it was cold. "All right, gentlemen," the auctioneer boomed, a foul, leering smile on his face. The main event, fresh from the Cimarron, a match set of three, tamed and ready for a firm hand to break them in. The crowd laughed, ugly, guttural sound. "We'll sell them as a lot," the auctioneer declared. "Let's start the bidding at $1,000. A man in a fancy suit, a man John recognized as the owner of a notorious saloon in Trinidad, immediately raised his hand. 1,000. Another man, a rancher with a cruel, porcini face, yelled, 1,500. The bidding was fast and furious. 2,000. 2,500. The price climbed, a testament to the dark, insatiable appetite of these men. John could see Ben, standing at the edge of the crowd, his face a stony, impassive mask, his hand never rising. He was following John's instructions perfectly. Wait. Let them show their hands. Let the price settle. The bidding stalled at $3,000, a staggering sum. The Trinidad saloon owner had the high bid. 3,000. Go in once, the auctioneer called out. Go in twice. It was now or never. John watched, his heart in his throat, as Ben finally, calmly, raised his hand. 5,000. Ben's voice was a low, powerful rumble that cut through the excited chatter of the crowd. A hush fell. $5,000. It was an incredible amount of money. All eyes turned to the big, silent blacksmith. The saloon owner, his face flushed with whiskey and frustrated desire, hesitated. He looked at Ben, at the man's sheer size, and the cold, hard look in his eyes, and he seemed to make a decision. The women were not worth a fight with a man like that. He shook his head and lowered his hand. $5,000, the auctioneer cried, his eyes wide with greed. Sold, to the blacksmith. John let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It had worked. The first part of his desperate gamble had paid off. He watched as Ben pushed his way through the crowd and handed over the heavy pouch of gold. He watched as the women's bonds were cut, and as Ben began to lead them away from the platform. But it was not over. A new figure stepped out from the line shack. He was a tall, well-dressed man, with a cold, handsome face and the dead, empty eyes of a snake. This was Jedediah Slater. Hold on there, blacksmith, Slater said, his voice a soft, dangerous purr. That's a fine purchase you've made. So fine, in fact, that I've decided I'm not selling. The crowd murmured. A deal was a deal. Even in this lawless place, there were rules. The deal is done, Slater, Ben said, his voice a low growl. I paid the price. Indeed you did, Slater said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And I appreciate your contribution to my coffers. But you see, I've just received a better offer. A private one. He looked at the women, his gaze lingering on Alara. These are not for you. He snapped his fingers, and a half-dozen of his armed thugs moved to surround Ben and the women. Ben stood his ground, his massive hands clenched into fists. He was a strong man, but he was 1 against 7. It was a hopeless fight. On the ridge, John Carter's world narrowed to the scene below. He had tried to do this with money. He had tried to do this the civilized way. But the devil did not honor bargains. He had one last card to play. He had hoped he would not have to. But they had left him no choice. He took a deep, steadying breath. He settled the stock of the Winchester against his shoulder. His target was not a man. It was a lantern hanging from the porch of the line shack, directly above a stack of what looked like extra barrels of whiskey. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a sharp, angry crack in the night. On the porch of the line shack, the lantern exploded. A shower of burning oil rained down on the whiskey barrels. The world erupted in a massive, rolling fireball. The front of the line shack disintegrated, the explosion a deafening, cataclysmic roar that sent men diving for cover, their screams lost in the thunderous sound. The Devil's Marketplace had just become a battlefield, and John Carter, the quiet rancher, had just announced his presence. The explosion was a physical blow, a concussion of heat and force that flattened the men closest to the line shack and sent a wave of panicked chaos through the rest. The Devil's Marketplace had become an instant, raging inferno. In that first, shocked moment of chaos, while Slater and his men were blinded and disoriented by the blast, Ben acted. He was not a gunman, but he was a man of immense strength and quick thinking. He grabbed Alara and Kimmy, shoving them behind him. Noah, run, he roared. He then picked up a heavy, discarded wagon tongue and swung it like a war club, clearing a path through the stunned, scrambling thugs. From his perch on the ridge, John worked with a cold, deadly efficiency. He was no longer just a sniper, he was a shepherd, and he was herding his flock to safety. He used the Winchester not to kill, but to control. A shot into the dirt in front of a charging thug, sending the man sprawling. A shot that splintered the leg of a table a man was trying to use for cover, forcing him back. He was a master of suppressive fire, his every shot a calculated move in a deadly chess game. Slater, his face a mask of furious disbelief, recovered first. He saw Ben and the women, making a break for the darkness at the edge of the firelight. "Get them!" he shrieked, his voice a raw and hinged sound. "Don't let them escape." He and his remaining men, their initial shock turning to rage, began to pursue them, firing their pistols into the shadows. John knew he had to do more than just provide covering fire. He had to draw their attention. He had to become the lightning rod for their fury. He stood up from his concealed position, a tall, solitary figure silhouetted against the night sky, and fired a shot directly into the center of their group. The bullet struck one of Slater's men in the chest, taking him down. It was a clear, unmistakable challenge. He was no longer a hidden sniper. He was a declared enemy. "He's on the ridge," one of the men yelled. Slater and the rest of his men spun around, their attention now fully on the lone figure who had just announced himself. They forgot about Ben and the women. All their rage, all their murderous intent, was now focused on the man on the ridge. They began to charge up the hill, a wave of angry, desperate men. This was exactly what John had wanted. He had drawn them away from their prey. He did not wait for them to reach him. He melted back from the ridge, a ghost disappearing into the darkness. He was leading them on a chase, into the broken, rocky country that was his ally. Meanwhile, Ben and the women had made it to the relative safety of a deep burrow a quarter-mile from the burning shack. Ben was a brave man, but he was a blacksmith, not a warrior. He was breathing heavily, his face pale. "He saved us," Noe said, her voice a quiet, awestruck whisper, as they listened to the sounds of the gunfight moving away from them. "The rancher. He did more than that," Alora said, her own voice filled with a new, strange emotion. She looked out into the darkness, in the direction John had gone. He declared war. They were safe, for the moment. But they were afoot, in the middle of a hostile wilderness, with a battle raging somewhere in the darkness around them. Back on the slopes, John was leading Slater's men on a deadly, one-sided hunt. He was the fox, and they were the hounds, but this fox had teeth. He would let them get close, then fire a single, well-aimed shot from an unexpected direction, taking another one of them down, before disappearing again into the rocks. The night became a terrifying, confusing nightmare for Slater's men. They were being picked apart, one, by an enemy they could not see. Their numbers dwindled. Their fear grew. The hunter was becoming the hunted. John was not a man consumed by bloodlust. Every shot he fired was a grim, necessary act. He was a surgeon, cutting away the cancer that was Slater's gang. Finally, only 2 men were left with Slater. They were cornered in a small, rocky basin, their ammunition running low, their nerves completely shattered. They were broken men. "Show yourself, you coward," Slater screamed into the darkness, his voice a ragged, desperate plea. The only answer was the sad, lonely whisper of the wind. John could have finished them then. He had them in his sights. But he did not. He had another plan. He wanted more than just their deaths. He wanted to destroy what they had built. He slipped away into the night, his work here, for now, done. He circled back to the arroyo where Ben and the women were hiding. He appeared before them as if from the very earth itself, a silent, grim figure in the pre-dawn light. "It's over," he said, his voice a low, tired rasp. "For tonight." He looked at the 3 women, at their tired, frightened, but resilient faces. He had bought them, he had fought for them. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life was now, for better or for worse, inextricably tied to theirs. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Slater's beaten, but he's not finished. He'll go for reinforcements. We have to get to my ranch. It's the only place we can fortify, the only place we can make a real stand." They began the long, weary walk back to the Circle C. They were a strange, and likely group of refugees, a quiet rancher who had just rediscovered the killer within, a brave blacksmith who had stepped out of his forge and into a war, and 3 tribal women who were the eye of the storm. They were the fire and the fury, and their war was just beginning. The journey back to the Circle C ranch was a grim, silent procession. They were 4 fugitives, moving through a land that had suddenly become hostile territory. The fire they had started at Slater's auction had been a beacon, and now, they were the ones being hunted. John Carter led them, his face a hard, unreadable mask. The quiet, grieving rancher had been completely consumed by the cold, efficient man of action he had been forced to become. He moved with a relentless purpose, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the butt of his Colt. They arrived at his ranch on the second day. The place was just as he had left it, a small, lonely outpost of civilization in a vast, empty wilderness. But it no longer felt like a place of grief. It felt like a fortress. Their last, best hope. Noe, Alara, and Kimmy looked at the simple, sturdy ranch house with a mixture of awe and apprehension. This was the world of the man who had saved them, a world of fences and square rooms, so different from their own. "It is a good place," Noe said, her voice a quiet affirmation. "A strong place." There was no time for rest. They knew Slater would be coming. John's first act was not to tend to his own exhaustion, but to prepare for the inevitable siege. The ranch became a hive of activity. John was the general, his quiet, authoritative voice directing their efforts. Then, the blacksmith, his massive strength a formidable asset, helped him fortify the house. They barricaded the windows, reinforced the doors, and dug a trench along the front of the porch. The women, far from being helpless wards, were an integral part of the defense. Noya, with her deep knowledge of the land, showed them how to create a series of almost invisible warning signal piles of stones, carefully balanced, that would be knocked over by approaching riders, their clatter echoing a warning to the house. Kimmy, the young girl, was surprisingly skilled with a rope. She helped John create a series of snares and tripwires in the tall grass surrounding the house, designed not to kill, but to slow down and disorient an attacking force. And Ilara, the quiet, watchful one, became their eyes. She had the keenest sight, and she spent her days on the low ridge behind the house, a silent, vigilant sentinel, watching the horizon for the first sign of dust. As they worked, a new, deeper bond was forged between them. They were no longer just a rancher and the women he had saved. They were a family, a small, unlikely clan, united by a shared danger and a common purpose. In the quiet evenings, after a long day of hard labor, they would gather in the main room of the ranch house. The house, which had been a place of lonely silence for so long, was now filled with the low murmur of conversation. John found himself talking more than he had in years. He told them about his wife, Martha, about the life they had built here. He found that speaking of her, to these women who had known their own profound loss, was not painful. It was a comfort. In turn, they told him about their people, about their traditions, about the long, slow, tragic process that had led to them being the last of their band. They were stories of resilience, of a culture that refused to be extinguished. John found himself looking at them with a new, profound respect. He had saved them from slavery, but they were now saving him from a different kind of prison of his own grief. They were bringing life back to his home, and to his heart. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day that passed was a day of taut, nervous anticipation. The attack came on the fifth day, at dawn. Alara, from her lookout post, saw them first. A large cloud of dust on the horizon. It was not just Slater and his handful of survivors. It was an army. He had, as John had predicted, gathered reinforcements. A score of the hardest, most desperate men he could find, all of them drawn by the promise of gold and the chance for a bloody revenge. The alarm was raised. John, Ben, and the women took their positions. The fortress of solitude was about to be tested. Slater's army of force of 25 ridders crested the rise and looked down at the small, isolated ranch. They saw a single house, a barn, and a few corrals. It looked like an easy target. Their confidence was their first mistake. They charged, a thundering wave of horseflesh and angry yells, expecting to overwhelm the small ranch in a matter of minutes. The first of the warning signals went off, the clatter of falling rocks echoing from the hills. The charge faltered for a moment, the men looking round in confusion. Then the first of the horses hit Kimmy's tripwires, sending their riders sprawling into the dust. The charge broke, dissolving into a confused, chaotic mess. And then, the guns of the ranch house opened up. John and Ben, from the fortified windows, laid down a withering, accurate fire. They were not firing wildly. Every shot was aimed. Every shot counted. The open ground in front of the house became a killing field. Slater's men, caught by surprise, their charge broken, scrambled for cover. The easy raid had turned into a bloody, protracted siege. The battle for the Circle C had begun. It was a fight for more than just a piece of land. It was a fight for a home. It was a fight for a future. And John Carter, the quiet rancher, stood at the center of it all, a man who had finally found something worth fighting and dying for. The siege of the Circle C was a brutal, grinding affair. For 2 days, Slater's men laid siege to the small ranch, their sporadic attacks repulsed by the determined, accurate fire of the defenders. The fortress of Solitude held, but the defenders were paying a price. They were running low on ammunition. Ben had taken a bullet in the arm, a painful but not life-threatening wound. They were exhausted, their nerves stretched to the breaking point by the constant tension. On the morning of the 3rd day, Slater tried a new tactic. Under the cover of a white flag, he approached the house alone. "Carter," he yelled, his voice a raw, angry sound. "This has gone on long enough. Send out the women, and I'll let you and the blacksmith live." John appeared at a window, his Winchester held ready. "The women aren't for sale, Slater," he called back. "They're savages," Slater screamed, his face contorted in a mask of frustrated rage. "They're not worth dying for." "They're more human than you'll ever be," John replied, his voice cold. "Now get off my land before I send you to hell." The failed negotiation marked the beginning of the end. Slater, his patience gone, ordered a final, desperate, all-out assault. The battle that followed was a chaotic, bloody climax to their long struggle. Slater's men charged the house from 3 sides, a human wave of desperation. John, Ben, and the women fought with the courage of those with their backs to the wall. The fighting was fierce, hand-to-hand in some places, as the attackers reached the porch. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of wounded men. In the final, desperate moments of the battle, Jedediah Slater himself broke through the line and stormed into the house, a pistol in each hand, his eyes wild with a murderous light. He was met not by John, who was busy holding off the attack at the windows, but by the 3 women, Noe, Elara, and Kimmy. They stood in the center of the room, not with guns, but with the weapons of their own people, a heavy, carved war club in Noe's hands, a long, sharp skinning knife in Elara's, and a simple, deadly courage in their eyes. Slater, who had seen them only as property, as savages, was so surprised he hesitated for a fatal second. In that second, they attacked. They were a whirlwind of righteous fury, 3 women fighting for their lives, for their dignity, for the man who had given them sanctuary. The great Jedediah Slater, the terror of the territory, died not by a bullet from a rancher's gun, but at the hands of the 3 women he had so brutally underestimated. His death broke the will of his remaining men. Seeing their leader fall, they broke and fled, a scattered, defeated remnant of a once feared army. The battle was over. The valley was quiet again, save for the moans of the wounded and the sad sigh of the wind. John, Ben, and the 3 women stood in the aftermath, exhausted, bloody, but victorious. They had held. They had survived. In the days that followed, a new world began to take shape. The threat of Slater was gone forever. The territory could breathe a little easier. John Carter looked at the 3 women who stood with him, not as his property, not as his wards, but as his family. He had bought them to save them, and in the end, they had all saved each other. "This is your home now," he said to them, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "For as long as you want it." Noah, the matriarch, looked at him, and her ancient, wise eyes were filled with a deep, profound gratitude. "We are your people, John Carter," she said, "and you are ours." The quiet, solitary rancher was alone no longer. His fortress of solitude had become a sanctuary of hope. And in the heart of the wild and forgiving West, a new and likely family had been forged in the crucible of fire and blood, a promise of a new day and a new, better world. The silence that fell after the battle was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of grief, of exhaustion, and of a profound, world-altering change. They had won. They had survived. But the valley, their sanctuary, was now a graveyard. The work of the next few days was a grim, necessary ritual. They buried the dead, friend and foe alike, in a single, long trench on the hill overlooking the ranch. It was a silent, somber task, each shovelful of earth a final punctuation mark on a chapter of violence and loss. The physical wounds began to heal. Ben's arm, though painful, would mend. The cuts and bruises they had all sustained would fade, but the deeper wounds, the scars on the land and on their souls, would remain. John Carter found himself in a strange, new territory. The single-minded purpose of the fight was gone, replaced by the quiet, daunting task of living. For the first time in years, his home was not empty. It was filled with the quiet presence of Noya, the gentle hum of Alara's songs, the youthful energy of Kimmy. The silence he had once cultivated as a shield against his grief was gone, and he found, to his surprise, that he did not miss it. The three women, too, were navigating a new world. They had been creatures of the wild, of the open spaces. Now, they were living within the strange, angular confines of a white man's house. They brought their world with them, filling the small ranch house with the scent of wild herbs, the soft texture of woven blankets, and the low, melodic cadence of their own language. A new, hybrid family was being formed, a delicate and complex ecosystem of shared loss and newfound hope. It was not always easy. There were moments of misunderstanding, of cultural friction. But underneath it all was a deep, abiding foundation of mutual respect and a shared and spoken gratitude. John began the slow, arduous work of rebuilding his ranch. He repaired the bullet-scarred walls of his home. He rebuilt the corrals. He began to round up the scattered remnants of his herd. He was a rancher again, but he was not the same man. The work was no longer a lonely penance. It was an act of creation, of building a future for the new family he had found. Noya, with her profound knowledge of the earth, became the heart of their new home. She started a garden, a sprawling, vibrant patch of life that produced not just vegetables, but the herbs and medicines that kept them healthy. She was the matriarch, the keeper of the old ways, her wisdom a steady, grounding force. Alara, the quiet, watchful one, found her voice. She had a gift for animals, a gentle, calming presence that could soothe the most spooked horse. She took over the care of the ranch's small herd, her skill and intuition far surpassing John's own. She was the nurturer, the healer of the wounded land and its creatures. And Kimmy, the young girl who had seen too much, began to heal in her own way. She attached herself to John, following him as he did his chores, her youthful curiosity a constant, welcome presence. He began to teach her to read and write, and in return, she taught him the names of the stars in her own tongue. She was their future, a bridge between their two worlds. They were a strange, beautiful, and resilient family, a testament to the idea that hope could bloom in the most unlikely of places. But the outside world, with its laws and its prejudices, could not be kept at bay forever. A month after the battle, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was the town marshal, a man named Davis, with a posse of a half-dozen deputies. They had come to investigate the reports of a small-scale war that had taken place at the Circle C. Marshal Davis was a good man, but he was a man of the law, a man of a world that did not understand the kind of justice that had been meted out in this valley. He saw the graves on the hill, he saw the three tribal women living in a white man's house, and his face was a mask of suspicion and confusion. "John," he said, his voice heavy, "you've got a lot of explaining to do." The world had come to their door, and it had brought its own set of rules, its own judgments. The battle for their lives was over. Now, a new, more subtle battle was about to begin, a battle for their right to exist, a battle for the future of the unlikely family that had been born from the scars of the land. Marshal Davis sat at John Carter's kitchen table, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand, his face a mask of wary confusion. He had listened to their story, a tale so wild, so steeped in violence and improbable alliances, that it sounded like something from a dime novel. He had seen the graves, the fortified house, and the strange, new family that now inhabited it. His lawman's mind struggled to fit the facts into the neat, orderly boxes of his legal code. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice a low, tired drawl. "You were attacked, left for dead. These women found you, saved you. Then you find out they've been captured by the men who had you attacked in the first place, a man named Slater. So you go to his illegal auction, start a firefight, and then lead a full-scale battle here, on your own land, resulting in the deaths of what, 2 dozen men? That about sums it up," John said, his own voice flat. "And you expect me to just, what, file this under self-defense and right away?" the marshal asked, a note of incredulity in his voice. "John, This is a massacre. By all rights, I should be arresting you and taking you in for trial. On what charge? Alara's voice, quiet but firm, cut through the tense silence. She had been standing by the hearth, a silent observer, but now she stepped forward. The charge of not allowing ourselves to be sold as slaves. The charge of defending our home from an army of murderers. She looked the marshal square in the eye, and her gaze was as steady and unyielding as the mountains. There is a law of the land, Marshal, and then there is the law of what is right. They are not always the same. The marshal looked at her, at the quiet, powerful dignity that radiated from her, and he found himself at a loss for words. The situation was a legal and moral quagmire. John Carter and his companions had, without question, engaged in a private war. They had taken the law into their own hands. But they had done so against a man, Jedediah Slater, who was a known criminal, a man who operated far outside the reach of the marshal's own limited authority. They had, in effect, done the law's own dirty work. While the marshal wrestled with his conscience and his duty, a new, more immediate problem arrived. A second group of riders appeared, a dusty, well-armed posse. But these were not lawmen. They were bounty hunters, drawn by the huge price that had been on Slater's head. Their leader, a man with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes, dismounted and strode onto the porch. "We're here for the Slater bounty," he announced, his voice a gravelly sneer. "We heard you folks were the ones who took him down. The bounty is ours, and so are his assets, including them." He gestured with his head towards the three women. "Tribal women are worth a pretty penny on the right market." The threat was naked, brutal, and immediate. The vultures had arrived to pick at the bones of the kill. John and Ben, who had been standing on the porch, moved to block the doorway, their hands on their guns. The marshal and his deputies, who had been inside, came out, their own weapons drawn. It was a tense, dangerous standoff. The bounty hunters were not a legal authority, but they were a powerful, lawless force. And they outnumbered the marshal's small posse. "This is official business," the marshal said, his voice a low growl. "These people are under my protection. Now get off this land." The bounty hunter leader laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your protection don't mean much out here, Marshal. We're taking what's ours." The situation was about to explode into another bloody gunfight. But it was Noya, the old matriarch, who diffused it. She stepped out onto the porch, her face a calm, impassive mask. She held something in her hands. It was a simple, leather-bound book. She walked past the armed men, who seemed to shrink back from her quiet, powerful presence, and stood before the bounty hunter. She did not speak his language. She simply opened the book. It was filled, not with writing, but with a series of intricate, beautiful drawings, done in charcoal and natural pigments. They were drawings of plants, of animals, of the stars. It was a chronicle of her people's knowledge, their history, their soul. She turned to a specific page. It showed a drawing of a particular, venomous snake, and next to it, the plant that was its only antidote. She then looked the bounty hunter in the eye and spoke, her voice a low, melodic chant in her own tongue. Kimmy, standing beside her, translated, her own voice clear and strong. "She says that the man you hunt is dead, but his poison remains. It is a poison of greed, of violence. A poison that is now in all your hearts." She pointed to the drawing of the snake. "She says there is a law that is older than the white man's law. It is the law of the land, the law of balance. You have come here with poison in your hearts. If you do not leave, this land itself will turn against you. You will find that the water will be bitter, the game will be scarce, and the snakes will find their way into your bedrolls." It was not a threat. It was a prophecy, a curse, delivered with the absolute, unwavering conviction of a woman who was a part of the very land she was describing. The bounty hunters, hard, superstitious men who lived their lives at the mercy of the wilderness, looked at the old woman, at the strange drawings in her book, at the absolute certainty in her eyes. And for the first time, they felt a flicker of a different kind of fear. Not the fear of a gun, but the fear of the unknown, of a power they did not understand. The leader stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then he spat in the dust. "This ain't worth the trouble," he growled. He turned to his men. "Let's ride." They mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a stunned, silent group of lawmen in their wake. Marshall Davis looked at Noya, at the book in her hands, and then at the strange, resilient family gathered on the porch. He had come here to enforce his law, but he had just witnessed a different kind of law, a different kind of power. He made his decision. My report will state that Jedediah Slater and his known associates were killed while resisting arrest, he said, his voice a quiet, official statement, and that the 3 dependents of the late Mr. Slater are now under the legal guardianship of his neighbor Mr. John Carter. He looked at John. It's not perfect, but it's the best I can do. It'll keep the vultures away. He had bent his own law, twisted it to fit the shape of the justice he had just witnessed. As the marshal and his men rode away, a new quiet peace settled over the valley. They were safe. They were legal. They had faced the 2 kinds of law that govern the West, law of the gun and the law of the book, and they had, against all odds, survived them both. The departure of the lawmen and the bounty hunters left the Circle C Ranch in a state of quiet, profound peace. The war was over. The outside world, for now, had been satisfied. They were left with the difficult and beautiful task of building a new life from the ashes of the old one. The ranch became a place of healing and of new beginnings. Then, the blacksmith, his arm now mending, decided to stay. He was a man without a family, and he had found one in this strange and likely community. He built a new forge, and the rhythmic, musical sound of his hammer became a part of the valley's new song. John Carter, with the help of his new family, began the slow process of rebuilding his herd and his home. The work was hard, but it was a good kind of hard. It was the work of creation, of life. The silence of his grief was replaced by the easy, comfortable sounds of a shared existence, the murmur of conversation around the dinner table, the sound of Kimmy's laughter as she learned to ride, the low, melodic hum of Alara's songs as she worked with the horses. The 3 women, who had been rootless for so long, began to put down their own roots in the rich soil of the valley. They were no longer just survivors, they were pioneers. Noya, the matriarch, became the heart of their home. Her garden expanded, a vibrant, sprawling testament to her deep, ancient knowledge. She was not just growing food, she was planting the seeds of her culture, of her people's story, in this new ground. She began to teach Eloise and John the old ways, the language of the earth, the stories that were carried on the wind. Alara, the healer, found her own purpose. The horses, under her gentle, intuitive care, thrived. But her healing touch extended beyond the animals. She had a quiet, calming presence that soothed the still-run nerves of their small community. She was the keeper of their fragile peace, a reminder of the quiet strength that had seen them all through the storm. And Kimmy, the future, blossomed, freed from the terror that had defined her young life. Her natural curiosity and intelligence flourished. She was a bridge between their 2 worlds, equally at home learning to read from one of John's books or learning the secret language of the birds from Noya. She was the living embodiment of their new, hybrid family. John Carter, the man who had been a fortress of solitude, found that his walls had crumbled, and in their place, a garden was growing. He had thought his life was over when his wife died, but these 3 women, who he had saved, had, in turn, saved him. They had brought life back to his home, and to his heart. He had started with a debt in the dust, and he had been repaid with a gift he could never have imagined, a second chance. They were a strange sight to the few travelers who passed through the territory, a white rancher and a blacksmith, living and working side by side with 3 tribal women. They were an anomaly, a small, defiant island of cooperation and respect in a world that was still largely governed by prejudice and violence. But their small experiment in living was a powerful one. It was the planting of a seed of an idea that a different kind of West was possible. A West where people were judged not by the color of their skin or the language they spoke, but by the strength of their character and the kindness in their hearts. Years passed. The scars on the land faded, covered over by the steady, patient growth of new grass and wildflowers. The raw, new wood of the rebuilt ranch house weathered to a soft, silver gray, settling into the landscape as if it had always been there. The small, embattled fortress had become a true sanctuary, a place of peace and quiet prosperity. The family that had been forged in the crucible of violence grew and thrived. Then, the blacksmith found a wife in the nearby town, a kind, strong woman who was not afraid of their unconventional family, and their children's laughter was added to the valley's song. Kimmy grew into a beautiful, intelligent young woman, a perfect fusion of her two worlds. She had Noya's deep wisdom of the earth and John's practical, steady knowledge. She was a new kind of woman for a new kind of West, a bridge to the future. Alara, the quiet healer, became known throughout the territory for her almost mystical skill with horses. Ranchers would travel for days to bring their best, most difficult animals to her, and she would gentle them not with force, but with a quiet, compassionate understanding. Noya, the matriarch, grew old, her face a beautiful, intricate map of a long and difficult life. She passed on her stories, her knowledge, her people's soul, ensuring that it would not be lost to the encroaching world. And John Carter, the man who had been left for dead in the dust, found a peace he had never thought possible. He was a husband again, in a way. He and Alara, to people who had been bound by a shared loss and a shared fight, found a deep, quiet love growing between them. It was not the passionate, youthful love he had known with his first wife. It was a quieter, more profound bond, a partnership of two scarred but resilient souls who had found in each other a safe harbor. One evening, as he and Alara sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the valley, a sight they had witnessed 1,000 times, she turned to him. "Do you ever think of them?" she asked softly. "The men who attacked you?" John looked out at the peaceful, thriving land that was his home. He thought of the long, bloody road that had led him here. The rage, the need for vengeance, it was all gone, a distant, faded memory. "No," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble. "I don't think of them at all." He reached out and took her hand. "I think about what they gave me." She looked at him, confused. "They gave you nothing but pain." "They gave me you," he said simply. "They led me to you, and to Noya, and to Kimmy. They took my life, and in its place, they gave me a better one." It was the simple, profound truth of their story. From an act of brutal, senseless violence, something beautiful and strong had grown. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching as the first stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky. The promise of the horizon, which had once been a symbol of an empty, lonely future, was now filled with the quiet, steady light of 1,000 tiny hopes. The debt had been paid. The whispers of the vultures were gone. And in their place was the quiet, enduring music of a family, a home, and a love that had, against all odds, been born from a promise of a new day.